you understand what a preprocessor is. You understand the difference between Less, Sass, and Stylus. So we're going to do a deep dive across all three, cover all of their features, what they can do, what they can't do, best use cases, which preprocessors you should pick depending on the project that you're working on, and then we'll talk a bit about setup, and then dig into the features of each one. So the features are set up beginner, intermediate, and advanced, and we'll go through each one in like 40 minutes. So it should be a lot of fun. I'm not going to guzzle the whole thing of water. I just went to the bathroom, so I'm totally good. If you came for the previous group, she was amazing, by the way. And then we'll dig in and talk about frameworks a bit. There are a lot of really good frameworks out there that we can use. And if you're lazy or efficient, like I am, then they're definitely worth peeking at. So first, let's talk about what a preprocessor is. And I think it's nothing short of just super magic. It does some really amazing things. I didn't reverse because it's super creepy, and it's just a little bit creepy, but it's an awesome joke. This is actually a movie, I'm cheating. So basically what a preprocessor allows you to do is it allows you to do things that you can't do natively in CSS or HTML or JavaScript. You can do all that stuff, but then you have to do something to compile everything and send it off to a browser in a way that it can understand. So we're taking all these magical things and then translating it to something that we can serve to a browser. So in our case, we're turning something into a CSS file that the browsers can interpret and do whatever they do with CSS. So across the board, there are three primary preprocessors that are the most popular. So we have Stylus, we have Less, and then we have Sass. So I'm a Sass guy. I love Sass. I worked on the website with Gina Bolton and Michael Parinto. So this is our love, our contribution to the Sass community. And yeah, so one thing to note before we get started is if you write kind of crappy CSS, a preprocessor isn't a silver bullet. So it's not going to make it any better. It's not going to unsuck your CSS. In most cases, if you don't write CSS very well, it's probably going to make it a lot worse. So keep that in mind as we talk through things. So quick start. The best way to get up and running in any preprocessor is to use a GUI application. So there are a lot of really good applications across the board for Linux, OS X, and Windows. One of my favorite is CodeKit for the Mac. It does a lot of amazing things. It has live reload built in. Who's never used live reload? You can raise your hand, don't be shy. A handful of folks. Let me explain something amazing. So live reload. Let's talk about standard workflow. You have your text editor open, you're typing some stuff, you make some changes, you go to the browser, you click refresh, wait for things to load, you make some more changes, go back to the browser, click refresh, and to see your changes. So what live reload does is it does that for you automatically. So you run live reload in the background, it checks to see if you make any changes, you just glance over, the browser changes automatically while you keep typing, you make some more changes, the browser changes for you. Now the nice thing about CSS is that it does all that transparently. So if you're ever trying to test something that has a state applied, like a modal window, and you make a change, refresh the browser, it blows everything away, and you have to go back through to get to the same state. So CSS is applied behind the scenes, so repaints kind of transparently, so you don't lose state, which is super magical. So that's live reload, which is not what this talks about, but it's amazing. On the Windows side, you have Prepros, which is basically the Windows version of CodeKit, also amazing. There's also Koala, which is kind of like CodeKit or Prepros, but it works across all the systems, so Linux, OS X, and Windows. It's pretty nice. And then for efficiency's sake, I use CodePen for almost everything. So if I'm trying to try out a feature, see how it works, see what doesn't work, test something new in a preprocess, I'll use CodeKit. Don't have to install anything. Everything's web-based in a browser. Chris Corrier is the guy that's behind this with a couple other folks. It's amazing because it has all the preprocessors built in for HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So you can think with anything on the fly. It's really handy. Now, if you're a little bit more brave, there's the command line option. So I'm a command line guy. I actually don't use any of the GUIs. It's easier for me for my workflow. So to get something up and running on a Mac, you're in luck. Sass is based in Ruby. So Ruby comes installed by default on the Macs. You just pop open your terminal, type in gem install Sass, and it pulls down the libraries and does its stuff. So you magically have Sass installed. And then the only thing that you have to create a Sass file, so you can do some Sass things in. And then you convert your Sass to CSS. It's not too bad. If you're on Windows, you have to install Ruby first, and then you get a Windows-specific command prompt that ties into Ruby stuff. For Less and Stylus actually are both built in Node, so they're JavaScript based. So you have to install Node first. They have a really easy single-click installer that'll set you up. Then you install NPM. NPM is Node's package manager, so it's kind of like a gem for Ruby. And then you do the same thing. Yeah, you install Less, and then you do some things with Less files. So don't be afraid of the command line. It's definitely nice to know, especially if you're a designer. You know, all the developers know the command line stuff, but you never know what the developers are going to be up to. They kind of do their own thing sometimes. And if they disappear for whatever reason, you can just jump in and go, hey, I know this. This is Unix. It's amazing. You can totally save the day and make sure that work keeps moving along and you get paid and nobody gets fired. So if you want a good rundown of command line, John Long out of Raleigh, North Carolina, and User Voice did a nice post on a designer's guide to the OS X command prompt. So it's pretty nice if you're a designer and you want to feel a bit more like a developer. You can totally read that. Now, compiling is one of the most important things you'll need to know, I think, because you have to take all these pre-processed things and convert them to CSS in some way. So there are four primary ways that you do this. The first one is compiling locally. This is the most common. Basically, you're running something in the background, either a GUI application or something in the command line that's converting your pre-processed files to a CSS file. That's simple. The second option is you can do this on deploy. So this is something you would typically do. You would tap the developer and go, hey, let's do this on deploy. This is more common in a web application space. Before you take your application and you deploy it to a server somewhere, you're compiling all your assets first, and then you're sending the CSS up to the server. The third option, which works just as well, is you can actually do all your compilation on a server somewhere. And the way that works is when somebody hits your page for the first time, you're telling the server to compile the CSS for you only the first time, and then you cache those results. So on the first request, you're translating your preprocessed file to CSS, then you cache that bad boy. The fourth option is, which was popularized by Less, is that you can compile on the client. So you use Less.js, for example, and the browser is basically doing that compilation for you. So you're actually writing your CSS in a JavaScript file, which is a little weird, and then the browser's making that compilation. Never ever do that. That's a horrible idea. Don't make the browser do that overhead. Don't, please don't. So let's dig in and talk about features. So syntax, Sass has a couple versions of syntaxes. The very first syntax that we see there at the bottom is the Sass syntax. It's a bit more terse. It's white space dependent, no curly braces, no semicolons. The one above that is the Sassy syntax. That was introduced shortly after the Sass syntax. It looks just like CSS. For Less, this is the Less syntax. Again, it looks just like CSS. Not too hard, right? Now, Stylus is super special. So Stylus also has two syntaxes. It has the CSS-looking syntax here at the top, and then it has its uber terse version, because it just doesn't care. No colons, no curly braces, no semicolons. You just kind of type stuff, and it just magically works. So feature-wise, one of the easiest way to take existing files, an existing set of CSS, and convert that to a preprocessed version of that file is just to simply change the file extension. Since all the preprocessors support the CSS syntax, change the file extension, magically you have a preprocessed file. So the file extensions are either SASS, SCSS, LESS, or STYL. So that'll get you across the board, pretty easy to go. Okay, so let's start digging into some of the features, and we'll talk a bit about some of the most basic things. And these are some of my most favorite. These are basically a lot of the things that I really wish that CSS let us do, and it's kind of getting that way. The syntax is a little bit weird, so I'd probably still use a preprocessor, even though some of these things are kind of creeping into CSS. One of my favorite things are variables. Nicole Sullivan tells a really good story about going into Facebook and trying to help them clean up their architecture just a little bit. Who's a developer in here? All right, awesome. So let's say a designer gives you a Photoshop file. In most cases, you don't have Photoshop, right, developers? So you end up taking like an eyedropper, and you're trying to pinpoint specific colors. So the developers of Facebook were doing this exact same thing, and they ended up with, I don't know, like 100 some odd versions of Facebook Blue all over the place. So what variables allow us to do is they basically allow us to take some information and store it somewhere. So it's a really simple key-value pair. You have a key, you have a value, and it can store just about any type of value. So in Sass, you define a variable with a $sign, and you give it a name. You can name that just about any way you want. You can do camel case. Personally, I prefer lowercase with hyphens, but it doesn't matter, as long as you name it something. And then you use that in your CSS. You just call the variable again with a $sign. In Sass, your variables are prepended with an @ sign instead of a $sign. And in Stylus, it just doesn't care. You just write something and put something on the right-hand side of it, and magically you have a variable. And then to just call that, and just call it down below. And this is what it spits out. So it takes whatever you assign to that variable and injects it into your CSS. Okay, so nesting. Nesting is the next thing that I was super excited about because it's one of the most natural things that I think, or I wish that CSS would let me do normally. So this is a really basic example of the typical CSS you would use for navigation. So you have a nav element, an ordered list, some lists, and a link somewhere. And that's kind of redundant. It sucks to type over and over again. So what we can do with nesting is we can do something kind of like this. So in Sass and less, you're basically just nesting things inside the brackets. That's how it knows what's being nested. In Stylus, you're just indenting things. And you just kind of type stuff. It's actually pretty easy to parse. I kind of dig it. I actually really like Stylus. Because I'm lazy or efficient, depending on how you look at it. And I hate typing. Okay, so this is what it spits out. So one thing to keep in mind with nesting is that you need to pay attention to the specificity. If you're doing something like that, you're being a bit more specific than you need to style the elements that you need to style. So what we can do is we can back out of our specificity just a little bit. General rule of thumb is kind of the 3-level inception. If you're going deeper than 3 levels in your nesting, you're probably going to be a bit too far, so take it back out of it. So we can do something like that. This is Stylus, and then we get something like this as our output. Now with nesting, there's also the ability to reference selectors. So you can reference an immediate parent, or you can reference an ancestor, or an ancestor that's further up the tree. So this is an example of a link. So typically if you were writing a link, you would do a colon whatever, to get those styles. So instead of doing that, we can actually nest those inside of the A and use the ampersand. So this is Sass and less. And what that ampersand does is it references the immediate parent. So in this case, it's going to reference the A. In Stylus, kind of the same thing. It's just, there's not a lot in there. No brackets, no colons, no semicolons. You just kind of type stuff, nested or appropriately. And then that's what it spits out. So the second version of that, we can actually inverse the ampersand. And this is what we would do if we wanted to select something further up that's not a direct parent, but it's an ancestor further up the DOM. So this is really popular if you're working with Modernizer and trying to target specific things. So if you're not familiar with Modernizer, it checks browser's capabilities and sticks a whole bunch of classes in your HTML tag. So it's either like Node.js or JS or no touch or touch. So you can target capabilities that the browser either has or doesn't have. So in this case, you can do something like this, target your I6, 7, 8 styles if you're using HTML5 boilerplates method of targeting IE, or if you're trying to target a touch device, you can do something like that. And what that'll do, spit out, wrong button, there we go. It'll spit out something kind of like this. So the ampersand is going to reference the nav, well, it's going to pop it up. So it's going to look for the ancestor I6 and use that as the very first class that it's going to target. So it kind of goes backwards. So it's super handy. Now, if you're familiar with the import directive in CSS, it allows you to separate out your files, be a bit more modular in your approach. But what the import directive does in native CSS is it still requires a separate server request to pull in those assets. What Sass does, less, and Stylus as well, is they kind of overtake that import directive, and it's a really easy way for concatenation built into Sass. So you can separate out your Sass files or your module files, if you want to call it that, into partials. These self-contained files that really shouldn't live alone, but they could if they needed to. And then you import those into kind of a master or base CSS file. So when you compile that, even though you may have 10 or 15 or 100 pre-processed files in the background, you're only generating a single file. So this is how it would look in Sass and less, is you're importing whatever the file name is, and it's going to concatenate a lot of stuff into a single file, or however you have your structure set up. Less looks like that. We just lost a semicolon. It's pretty much the same. So let's move up a level and talk about some of the intermediate things that we can get out of the preprocessors. Mix-ins are amazing. Who enjoys writing vendor prefix files? Only Darcy. What? Nobody enjoys writing vendor prefixes. It's such a pain. So mix-ins are a great way to encapsulate bits and pieces of CSS that you want to reuse over and over again. So in this instance, we have a class called box, and we're giving it some border radiuses because that's the cool thing to do, or was maybe a year or two ago. Maybe not anymore. Everything's flat now. And what we would do then instead is we create a mix-in. So in Sass, you define a mix-in with an ampersand mix-in. You give the mix-in a name, and then in parentheses, you can define an argument. So in this case, we're defining a radius. We want to pass in a pixel value for our radius. And then we put in this, the vendor prefix stuff that we want to output in our mix-in. And then to call that down below, you just do add include, whatever the mix-in names was. In this case, it's border radius. Put in the pixels, and we get a nice little simple mix-in. In less, it looks like a class with a parameter. That's how it works. And then you call it down below. And then Stylus, it doesn't really care. It almost looks like a variable because it kind of is. So you have a key and a value with some stuff nested inside of it, and then you call it down below. Stylus is actually pretty smart because they have transparent CSS3 mix-ins. So if you're writing CSS in Stylus and you're using any of the CSS3 magical things like linear gradients, text shadow, all that stuff's transparent. They have a lot of that built into Stylus already. I love Stylus. And this is what it would spit out. So basically what we started out with. But instead of having to write that a million times, we're trying to use border radius, we define it once and just call our mix-in. Now Sass kind of pioneered this idea of being able to extend things. So the challenge with a mix-in is that it looks nice and dry in your pre-processed files, but it's not very dry in the output. Because everywhere you use that mix-in, it dumps in that chunk of code you define. So the folks at Sass felt the need to create kind of an alternative to a mix-in, where you're basically creating some type of a placeholder that you want to reuse over and over again. So the difference between a mix-in and extend is if you have the need to pass in some type of an argument or a variable or some type of parameters, and use a mix-in. If you're just using some placeholder information that you want to reuse later on, use extend. So this is roughly how it works. So we have a class called borders with some stuff inside, and then we want to use the CSS inside of that in our paragraph and then in our list. So in Sass we do ampersand extend, and then whatever the name of it is. So you can actually just extend to any class. So any class you have, you just extend that way, which is pretty nice. In less, they have a slightly different syntax, and extend doesn't work quite the same. It's gotten a lot better. It was pretty buggy in the beginning, but now it's not too bad. So their extend is that they're trying to follow pseudo-selector paradigms that exist in current CSS, which is fine, I guess. But it basically functions the same way. So they're extending the borders, which is up top. And then Stylus basically just copied what Sass was doing. So it does the exact same thing, exact same syntax, with just less stuff. And it would spit out something like this. So the nice thing about extend is anything you're extending gets chunked into one CSS declaration that's commonly limited. So instead of doing that, if you call that extend 10 times, it's only going to exist in one place. Whereas if you call the mix in 10 times, it's going to exist in 10 places. So that's the really nice thing about the extend, is that the output's much cleaner. It's something more along the lines of you would hand code, and I really dig it. Now, one of the things that Sass also noticed is that people were starting to use classes like that as placeholders, but they weren't actually using that class anywhere in their HTML. So what they created then was they invented an invisible placeholder. So instead of doing a class, you change borders, remove the period, and stick in a parentheses instead. So what that tells Sass is that this is an invisible placeholder. It's just used to toss in some CSS, but it should never be output alone. So you extend it the same way, with the exception of using a print or the name went out right. Percent sign. Thank you. It started with a P. A percent sign borders, and this is what you would get. So basically the same thing, but without the class up top. Okay, so let's move up a bit more and talk about some advanced techniques. And this is where the preprocessors start to really separate on their capabilities. So Sass, well, they all have this idea of creating functions. Functions' basic purpose is to, well, I use it to crunch numbers. I'm not a very math-minded person, so we can do that calculation, all these calculations, nods and ends in a function. So in this case, we're going to use a couple variables. This is a really super simple grid system creator. Really simple. So what we want to do, we want to define a 12-column grid. We're going to base it on a 960 grid, but we want to convert all those values to percent-based widths. So what we want to do, we're going to create a function. So in Sass, you do ampersand function. You give the function a name. In this case, we're calling our function calculate column width, and then we can pass in some variables or some arguments. So we want to pass in the column. So basically, we want to calculate something based off 12 pixels, our 12-column grid, and calculate a width based on the columns that we define. So 3 of 12 columns, 8 of 12 columns, whatever that is, 1 to 12 is what we can put in there. And then we do our formula. So this is basically taking that information, converting it to a percent-based width, and we use it down below. So when you call a function, Sass kind of changed the way that they would call that. So for mixins, you would typically call at mixin or at include. Functions, you don't do at function to call it. You just put in the function name and whatever you're passing in. So in this case, we're doing an article and an aside. The article is going to take up 8 columns. The aside is going to take up 4. Less, everything in less is kind of class-based. So mix-ins, functions, they all kind of look the same. So we're basically doing the similar thing, except we need to stick a width in there for less, so we can spit that out. Then what the only thing we have to do is we just call the function down below as calculate column width, and it'll spit in the width and the value for us. Stylus, it looks kind of like less, but kind of not. You're just kind of typing stuff and nesting it correctly, and it kind of works. And you call it the same way you would with Sass. And this is what it would spit out. So we have an article width of 66.66667%, and then a aside that's 33.33333. So it'll do all those calculations for us based on that single function. So it's very, very handy. Now, in Sass, in all the preprocessors, there are a number of pre-built functions. A lot of those have to do with colors. So if you're a designer, you can go mad with color theory things in code and do some really nifty things. So Sass has a handful: RGBA, hue, saturation, lightness, light and dark, and saturate, desaturate, grayscale things. Less, they have not quite as many, but they have a handful that are pretty good. And then Stylus is about along the same lines as Less. But they all work roughly the same way. Now, in Sass, we also have control directives. So these are basic logic statements that let us do a lot of things. So Sass by far has a lot more. So you have basic if else, then for each and while. And we'll dig into some of these examples. Less just has when. That's basically the only logic you can write, which is super weird. And it makes me a little bit sad. It's kind of hard to work with. And then Stylus doesn't have as much either, but it's not too bad. So this is an example, creating a slightly more complex mix-in and dumping in a little bit of logic. So we're going to create a mix-in that will create some buttons for us. So we're going to define 3 types of buttons. We basically want to create a button, or a mix-in that'll create a button that's flat, because that's the cool thing to do. Or we'll do one that's a gradient, just kind of old school. And then we want to create a glossy button, because that was really awesome back in the late 90s and early 2000s. So basic if statement, ampersand if. So in our mixin, we're defining 2 arguments. We want to pass in a color, and we want to pass in a type. So if it's a flat button, we're just going to give it a background color. If it's otherwise, if it's a gradient, then we're going to use a linear gradient and give it a couple color stops. If it's going to be glossy, then we're going to give it a couple color stops, but have them butt up against each other. And now to call a mix-in, we just use like we would normally down below. So we include buttons. We're going to make a green button. We're going to make it glossy because it's super retro. Now, if you're going to take that and write it in Less, that's kind of what you would have to do. Because you don't have an if statement, you're basically just doing a series of when statements. That to me just feels really weird, but you can totally do it, and that's how it worked. And then in Stylus, it's basically the same version of Sass without curly braces and colons and semicolons. You just type stuff, and it just knows what to do. And that's what it would spit out for me. All 3 of them give you the same result. So Sass specific, we have for loops. So a lot of the looping that exists in Sass and nowhere else is really great to generate lots of code. Again, if you're lazy or if you can generate a lot of code from scratch without really doing a lot of work. So in this case, we're going to create some borders that are 1 to 5 pixels and just spit all that stuff out for us. So that's what we would get with a few lines of Sass. And you can go hog wild with a lot of this stuff and do some really crazy things. Now there's also an each loop. The each loop allows us to do something really funky with some of our variables. Now, you can actually kind of do a poor man's array or a list as variables. So we're going to create a variable, we're going to call it emotions. And in our emotions, we're going to put in happy, sad, excited, and mustached, because that's totally an emotion. And then we're going to iterate over each of the items in that variable, or the list is what we call it. So for each emotion in emotion, so we're defining something new. Typically there's, when you're using each, you're going to do singular and plural. So since it's a list, we're going to make that one, make sure that one's plural. That's just an easy way to name things and have it make sense. So for each emotion and emotions, we're going to generate some CSS. We're going to have a class, we're going to call it feeling, do a hyphen, and then you'll notice something kind of weird. We have a hash with some curly braces. So this is called interpolation. So this allows us to take what's in there and let Sass know that we don't want you to render a class feeling hash curly braces emotions. We want you to render something that we're storing in Sass somewhere. So the interpolation lets Sass know that we're pulling in information somewhere else. Don't render exactly that. And then we're going to create a background image with some images that again have a feeling and whatever the emotion is. And again, we're using interpolation to pull in those values. So when it spits it out, that's what we get. So we get a class for feeling happy, feeling sad, feeling excited, and feeling mustache. Now, so media queries. So there's a good bit of talk about responsive web design at the conference this year, and there very well should be. So across the board, you can do some pretty nice abstractions to handle media queries and make that easier on the pre-process side. So you can take breakpoints you can assign those to variables. I do small, medium, large, extra large, amazingly huge, depending on what I'm trying to target. Chris Clear likes to call it, we're doing mobile first, so we're doing small breakpoint, medium breakpoint, and a large breakpoint. And we're just nesting those right inside. Let's see. So for less, it looks exactly the same. The only thing that it does, you would have to do is change out the way you call your variable. So $sign versus the ampersand, and that magically works. Stylus, again, you're just kind of typing stuff. We have our variables up top, and it looks the same way without all those semicolons and colons and curly braces. And that's what it spits out. So it takes the media queries and shows us back out in front, and then nests, or aside in this case, inside the media query where it should be. Now, one of the things specific to Sass that the other preprocessors don't have is this idea of a content directive. It's almost kind of like a reverse mix-in. So what we can do with this is we can create a mix-in. We're going to call this a respond to, because we want to respond to a specific name. And then we're going to sprinkle in some really simple logic. So in essence, what we're trying to do, we're trying to take all that extra media query fluff and abstract that out into something that's easier to remember. So we're going to create the mix-in, and we're going to have that mix-in respond to a small screen, medium screen, and a large screen. So we're defining those variables ourselves. So if it's a small screen, we're going to render our small screen media query. If it's a large screen, we're going to render our large screen media query, and it'll keep going that way. Now, the thing that you see that's special is the at content. So what that allows us to do, and then that gets rendered wherever the content is inside the media query. So we use that here, and that's what it spits out for us. So instead of having to remember what type of media query am I using max width or min width, or whatever else we're trying to use, we can abstract those out into a mix-in, and then use that throughout the site. So it's just an easy way to manage how we're handling our media queries. Now, if you're working on a large developer team, that's an easy way to keep your media queries from just spiraling out of control. So you're trying to keep things a bit more concise, so folks aren't just adding media queries left and right. So you can just point them to the documentation and go, hey, this is what we have in place to handle our media queries. Did anybody go to Sass conference in New York last year? Nobody. Oh man. So Sass had their own conference, and Chris Epstein and the guys behind Sass, and Compass, and Eric Suzanne Myers from Suzy, their grid framework, they pushed really, really, really hard to get in a whole bunch of brand new features. So they did a handful of new features for Sass, lots of new things for Compass that we'll talk about here shortly, and then lots of new things for Suzy, basically a new rewrite for Suzy for an unobtrusive grid system. One of the features in Sass that I absolutely love is the ability to create hash maps. So we've already had the ability to create kind of like a really simple array or list of items that we can iterate over. But in some cases, there's a need to build a little more into those relationships. One of the things that I use it a lot for is to generate icon fonts. So whenever you use an icon font, a lot of that can be class-based, and then you have to remember the key code that actually makes that icon font show up somewhere. So in this case, we can create a hash called icons, and then inside that hash do a key value pair as a list. So in this case, we're going to create a home icon, an about icon, and a services icon, so we can map the name to the key code for each one. And then we can use each again. So the first two variables that we see in our each map to the first key, or the key and the value for each item in the list. So we name that whatever we want to name that so it makes sense. So in our case, we have the name of the icon and then the key code of the icon, and then we have to define what hash we're trying to iterate over. So in this case, our hash is called icons, which is the same we see up top. And so again, we're using this to generate a whole bunch of CSS for us. So if you have 40 or 50 icons, you can do this and just write it in about 4 or 5 lines of Sass. It'll generate all your stuff for you. So we're using interpolation again to create an icon with the correct name of the icon. So it's going to be icon-home about our services. And then we're using the before pseudo selector in CSS to inject the key code before the content. And then once we map that to the actual font file, it'll show the correct icon. So it'll spit out, well, you can kind of then use Stylus as well. So if you use a for loop instead of an each loop. I'm assuming that works. I tried to test it in CodePen, but it kind of exploded for non-syntactical issues. I think CodePen hasn't updated to the newest version of Stylus yet. So it didn't know what to do because hash maps are new kind of across the board. But that's what it would spit out for you. So we get all that stuff with very little CSS or very little Sass. It's super magical. So you can do a lot. So for Blend conference that I run, we have 60 some odd speakers, and I use this exact same method to handle all of our speaker information and generate a bunch of classes to create speaker heads that float around and do stuff. So it works out pretty well. So let's talk about frameworks a bit. Compass is a great CSS3 framework. It's absolutely magical. And it's basically a wrapper. You remember the very first mixing we did for border radius? It does all that for you. So if you're lazy / efficient, use a framework that exists. Compass is great. SUSE is an unobtrusive grid framework. I love SUSE because it does the math for me, but doesn't force me to use any type of CSS classes or methodology to create a grid system. So I use them for the math, and I have all the grid stuff happen behind the scenes. And then, again for Sass, there's another framework called Bermon. Bermon's been doing some really amazing things. This is another CSS3 mixing library for Sass. And then here's another one as well for less, that's pretty good, called Less Hat. And then on the Bermon side, there's also a grid framework called Neat. That's pretty much the same as SUSE. They're both fantastic. If you're using Stylus, there's something called Nib that gives you a lot of those transparent CSS3 mix-ins. It's much smoother to work with than the others. And then you also have Roots, which is another set of function and helpers for Stylus. And then if you're going all out frameworks, you have Foundation, which is a mobile-first Sass framework, which is kind of the same thing as Bootstrap. Bootstrap is built in less, but there's also a Sass port. There may be a Stylus port, I'm not quite sure. And then, but before we wrap up, one thing that I would like to mention or keep in mind is, you know, Sass is built in Ruby. Ruby's all right. It can be a little bit slow if you're trying to compile very large files. So the folks at Sass kind of know this. So Hampton Caitlin and a handful of other folks actually hired a guy that writes C. So he's been taking the Sass libraries that are written in Ruby and converting all that stuff to C++. So I think he said it was like 200 times faster, something like that. It's amazingly fast because it's a C++ library and it's written at a system level, so it works across Linux, Windows, and Mac. And then instead, what they have wrappers. So they have wrappers for Node, Ruby, PHP, Python, so you can use Sass anywhere, and it's blazing fast. It's not quite one-to-one to what's in the current version of Sass, but it's getting pretty darn close. So that's coming up on the horizon, and may eventually overtake Ruby, I'm not quite too sure, but it's just amazingly fast. So that's pretty much all I have today. So we have a little bit of time for a couple questions, maybe a few more than that if you ask them quick.
Can you tell us how you make a decision as to which one to use depending on your projects?
So her question is, how do you make the decision to choose which one to use depending on projects? So if, for me that's basically language based. If I'm doing something in Node, I would use Stylus. It's much nicer, has a lot more features. If I was doing something in Ruby, I would use Sass, obviously. I probably never use less, but there's not really a need. If you're doing something in PHP, I'm not sure the best route to go. If you use .NET, Microsoft recently allowed the .NET framework to compile less in Sass. No Stylus, sadly, but that's kind of my thing. depending on what language you're writing in, would be the one that I would choose. So Node, I would go with Stylus. Ruby, I would go with Sass. .NET, I would go with anything else, I would go with Sass, but I'm a Sass guy. Any other questions? We'll go, you in the back. Yep, you.
Do you have a philosophy on how you structure your partials?
So do I have a philosophy on how I structure my partials? Yes, so I normally do that in a number of ways. So I have some base files, which is basically kind of a custom version of normalize, broken up into about 10 different style sheets, one for headers, one for paragraphs, one for whatever. And then everything else is divided up in a modular fashion. So an accordion in CSS would drive an accordion in its own file, CSS for list, CSS for sliders if you want to do sliders. Basically anything that can be singularized into a single module, I put that in its own partial. And then on the converse, I separate out things that take care of structure and things that take care of theme, or the aesthetics. So those are in separate files, and then I bubble those up using imports to have a scaffold file and a theme file for each project. So I know that if there's some kind of a structural issue, it's over on this side. If there's a visual issue, it's over on that side in the theme.
I didn't understand any of the partial stuff, so you may have just answered this question. But in the previous talk, you talked about a lot about modules. How do you see free compilers and free processors working with the concept of modules, both in terms of a more esoteric sense and more maybe going into the future with web components where they actually are sandboxed?
Oh man, web components are amazing. I'll answer your question, and I think we're out of time. So I'm not sure if the preprocessor will ever really try and solve that. That's not really what they're there for. Most of the web components is more on the HTML side, not so much on the CSS side, even though the CSS would tie into that a bit. But as far as trying to create modular structure, doing it in CSS is pretty easy. But trying to take the HTML component of that and tie it together, there's not a good solution that I'm aware of. One day, maybe. If you have an idea, come talk to me. Yeah, one more and we'll go.
Question. What's your vision of your next CSS generation? How long is it last?
Hold it. Say it one more time, they were clapping.
Okay. What is your vision for next generation of CSS? And I'm assuming next generation CSS, maybe next two, or cover whatever you have right now.
Yeah, so the next vision of CSS. So for vanilla CSS, the W3C is actually trying to incorporate a lot of this stuff to make CSS a bit smarter. So they have variables and they have a handful of other things. The syntax is a little bit weird. Again, kind of to his question, there's a big push to make things more modular. Web components is a big push. So trying to marry custom web components or custom HTML and CSS in some way, I think that's the direction that things are going. But we'll see. I have no control over any of that. Cool. Thanks, everybody.